we all want things to be better and we want to do good, but there's very little that gets done when you sort of generalize and have it in such a big way. If you think about everyone that has these different backgrounds, then you can't treat everyone the same. When you talk about just like the differences in how we grew up, it can be so deeply rooted in just how differently we think about certain things. To recognize your own biases, that's a whole journey too. There's an aspect of sort of trust that people look at me and say like, oh, you look like me, so I feel more comfortable telling you something than I might feel telling somebody else. If you hear stories of a lot of people who are immigrants to this country, there's this idea of the perpetual foreigner. I'm never gonna be like American enough. I'm always gonna look different. And then if I were to ever go to Korea, they would say the same thing. You're not Korean. Your Korean's not that good. In American culture, it's you have a thought and you say it. And I think that almost a lot of times it feels like we hate the silence so much that we try to like fill up the quiet. But I think that for a lot of Asian cultures, like that's not entirely the case. Like, you know, if it's not adding value to a conversation, it's not adding, you know, like, I don't want to say it. And I've talked to people who have said like, do I have to say something? Is this something that I should already know? It's a completely different language to speak, but even for myself, I feel very uncomfortable doing that.
Welcome to the Light Pod, built by Light Eye, the #1 podcast for thought-provoking and inspirational conversations when it comes to the people, the process, and the product behind design, all with a little love for lighting. I'm your host, Sam Corbel, and today we welcome David Seok to the podcast, all to talk about DEI, what it means, why it's important, and also how it's being put into practice, and how you can get involved in it, whether that's looking at the people in the workplace or the projects that you're working on. David, welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Well, I appreciate you sitting down with me today. I know that your heritage is Asian and you've practiced design for how many years now?
So I have been practicing lighting for just over 12 years now.
So you've seen, a large cross-section of people, and it's easy to say that, everybody doesn't necessarily identify like you do as an Asian person. There's a lot of white people in this industry. There are some blacks, there's some Hispanics and Latinos, but they really are all minorities. And it's important that we not only acknowledge that, but we learn how to support that in the right ways, and also just understand why that support needs to exist.
Oh, absolutely.
Before we dive into the juice and the meat of what you have to share with us today, I want to just reflect on, why it's important that inclusivity is something that we understand the meaning behind of, and then also understand how we might be blind to it. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I think the important thing to realize when we're talking about inclusivity is first recognizing that everyone is coming from a different place. You have different backgrounds, whether that means their socioeconomic status, their cultural or heritage backgrounds, and really acknowledging, first of all, that that's going to have an impact on how they grow in their career and how it's going to just affect their everyday work. So the idea of inclusivity is to, whatever those different backgrounds are, how do you take barriers down that keep you from succeeding? So how do you get everyone to, how do you get the best out of everyone, basically? I think that's sort of the key.
Mm-hmm. Diversity and equity are two things that also get paired with this, known as DEI. Talk to me a little bit about the D and the E in that equation.
Sure. So I think the D is really the easiest part, diversity. It's easy to say, hey, you and I are not the same. And that's very easy to identify. And it's also something that has been a focus in corporate America and the workplace for a very long time, for decades now. What we're finding now is that the more that we go deeper into diversity, it's, okay, now you have a diverse team, but the opportunities for everyone looks different. So then how do you maximize the potential of those different employees, instead of looking at things through a certain lens and the way that you personally grew up and what your ideas of success and leadership are? How do you work with people? How do you look at people that come from these different backgrounds, different perspectives, and how do you really fully utilize that to the advantage of the company and to the growth of the company? So when we talk about equity, there's equity and then there's equality. And I think a lot of people mistake the two, and it's easy to. Equality being the idea that I treat everybody the same, right? It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone gets fair treatment. And again, if you think about everyone that has these different backgrounds, then you can't treat everyone the same. You ever see that graphic where you have like the animals? There's like a tiger, a monkey, and like a fish, and you say, go climb the tree. And,
No,
like,
I haven't seen it.
You've never seen that before?
I love it.
And it's like, if you were measuring success as like, how well can you climb this tree? And like the fish is terrible at it, then, how that doesn't make any sense. And I think the same way when you look at people have different strengths and weaknesses. And again, those different perspectives and, backgrounds are going to offer very different aspects to the company, I think.
Yeah. And when you look at people, the color of the skin is one thing that we have, but then there's as you mentioned, socioeconomical classes that people come from. There's just straight up the culture. Right?
Oh yeah.
And I think that's probably like one of the more important things to realize is, you and I, we look different, but we're both educated, but we also probably come from our immediate families have different cultural differences, but then the heritage of where we come from has different cultural differences. And because of that, there's strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
And being not only open to that, but understanding of how to accommodate that and use it to the benefit of a group of people seemingly is obvious, but not so much. How do we take everything we're going to talk about today and just, take one or two steps to turn this into action as opposed to a conversation?
I mean, I think with anything, the first step is really just awareness, right? And I think that the emphasis on diversity is really to identify first that there are differences, and that's not a bad thing. Once you do that, then you can start to come up with like different plan of action, and then also like recognizing like, hey, how can we help this person to grow and to really provide their best at as far as, lighting design or whatever it might be. I think a lot of times we talk about DEI or we talk about things that make us feel good, and we all agree this is a good thing, but how exactly are we going to get there? So I think the more time that people are able to talk to one another, to communicate with one another, I think this kind of setting, the podcast, and like you said, that really is the goal for people to be able to learn and to hear from other perspectives. When you talk about just like the differences in how we grew up, like it can be so deeply rooted in just how differently we think about certain things. And if I can just sort of get into a little bit of an example.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, enough with the theory, right? Let's get into the application.
But the theory is important, right? I mean, it's important to recognize that learning and becoming aware is part one. So I'm here with you learning right now.
Sure. Yeah. For me, my DEI journey really, there were a lot of steps that led me to where I am today. I never would have imagined that I would be identified by Sam Corbel and the Light Eye as an expert in this topic. But yeah, there have been so many steps that have led me here, and just one of the thing that really helped to spring it into action is like I wanted to do something. I'm born and raised in New York City, so I'm American. I went through the American school system, and I don't know, I didn't really think about like being Asian or like what that meant. I was like, oh, well, I'm Asian American. I'm just as American as anybody else. And I think also growing up in New York City, I had the immense privilege to grow up in such a culturally diverse and rich city where I could very easily have like, I could go for like weeks only talking to Korean people just because my neighbors or like the church community that I was part of, like I could just be surrounded by Korean people and not have to think about the fact that I'm, not the same as somebody else. Mm-hmm. And then very easily I could turn around. I could like have my Black or Jewish friends or whatever. And that's just the beauty of New York. And I loved growing up there. And then going to Philly was so bizarre. Like when I went to college and I was the one of two Asian people in the architecture program at Drexel, all of a sudden I was Asian Dave. And I was like, why am I Asian Dave? Like there's no other David in the program. Why am I Asian Dave? Yeah. It didn't make any sense. And a lot of it changed when I went back to New York. So Lighting Practice opened an office in New York about a little over 5 years ago now. And from the very beginning, it was completely different. Like the very first person that we hired as a full-time was another Asian person. I'm like, all of a sudden, like we were the majority. There were 3 people in the New York office and 2 of them were Asian. And I was just like, oh, this is kind of cool. Now it's like, we'll just like have afternoon boba breaks or something like that. And this is like such a normal thing versus when I was in Philly and I was working, I would go out to lunch, come back with a boba. And I was just like, oh, what is that? Like, what are you drinking? And I'm just like, this is boba. This is like a very normal thing. Granted, that was like 10 years ago. The lighting practice, for a while, 3 out of the 4 partners were Penn Staters. And then going to New York where hiring was we would hire from like Parsons, and then Parsons versus Penn State, the demographic is completely different, right? You're looking at like deep Pennsylvania versus New York City. And all of a sudden when I'm looking at like resumes and I'm interviewing people to hire for the New York office, I'm getting a very different like group of people than I might be getting from Penn State.
What's happening right now that's changing the lens we look through?
It's hard for me to say because now that I am in New York, the lighting design industry looks like how New York looks. And I don't know that that's true everywhere. And I don't know that that's true here at Enlighten. And that can be a conversation too. Who's attending the ILD conference? And what are the barriers to that? Like, this is an expensive conference. I probably don't want Chris Knowlton to hear this.
That's okay.
But like you said, I'm just going to just lay it all out. As I said before, diversity and the focus on diversity in a workplace is not new. That has been going on for decades. I would say the past 4 or 5 years, since 2020, that has really been the explosion of this conversation of DEI as we know it. In the wake of the protests for George Floyd, in the rise of anti-Asian hate during the whole COVID thing, that's where I think a lot of people felt, similar to myself, like just wanting to do something and wanting to step up. Just to see how many organizations have started since 2020, right? Like Equity in Lighting, Asian lighting community started like 2 years ago. I think Build, Light Justice. So that's just the lighting industry. But I think the world as a whole has started to say, hey, systematically, there are things that can be done a little bit better. And I think that has been really a huge part of it.
In the last 4 years, you mentioned all of these organizations that have developed. There's a specific need behind each one of them. There's a specific mission behind each one of them. It all comes from people with a desire to do things. What are some of the stories that you can share with us around other people's experiences? And
the reason that I wanted to start the Asian lighting community was because I think, again, there's a sense of we all want things to be better and we want to do good, but there's very little that gets done when you sort of generalize and have it in such a big way. And so what I really wanted to do with the Asian lighting community was to really focus in on what I know. And so I could speak to my experiences. I don't want to speak for other groups because those are not the experiences that I grew up in. And I think that I think I'm very fortunate to have grown up Asian American, And it's such an interesting thing because if you hear stories of a lot of people who are immigrants to this country who are Asian American or something else, there's this idea of the perpetual foreigner. And so you're never going to be home no matter where you are. So I'm here in America. This is where I grew up. This is where I'm born. And I'm never going to be like American enough. I'm always going to look different. And then if I were to ever go to Korea, they would say the same thing. You're not Korean. Your Korean's not that good. My Korean is actually terrible. But they would point at me. They'd say, you're American. So then now I have like nowhere that's like my true home. But the other thing that does offer is that now through that sort of intersectionality, I'm able to look at two different perspectives. So I can speak to the American perspective and to the American education system that I went through and the culture that I grew up in, and I could speak to that. And also with what I grew up with my family and my parents and the people around me. And then also I think there's an aspect of sort of trust that people look at me and say like, oh, you look like me. So I feel more comfortable telling you something than I might feel telling somebody else. So one of the examples is that as a studio leader at opening up the New York office for the lighting practice, I got to be involved with a lot of the recruiting and a lot of the hiring practices. And, we're bringing in all these people, and something that I noticed immediately was when we were interviewing people that the people that I thought were good, the people that I thought were solid candidates were not the same candidates that I thought the partners would think. And for me, I was like, I don't know what you're seeing, but like this person looks great. Like, why aren't we hiring this person? Like, oh, well, this person, they like this better, or like this person looks better on paper. And I was like, well, this person has like a really good attitude. This person has like a really strong like work ethic. And like the more we did that, the more I was like, oh, like there's something different here. And then I realized that I needed to change my approach and how I spoke to candidates that we were interviewing. And then because of like the way that I look, I've had follow-up conversations after the interview, after they come and meet everyone, they meet all the partners. And I was like, hey, how do you think that interview went? Just like, whatever. And they're like, oh, that was really tough. That was really hard. Like I felt so uncomfortable during that interview. And I'll just be like, well, why? Why do you feel that? And a lot of it, I think, is also for me culturally, having grown up, like we're told like not to brag about ourselves or not to like speak highly of ourselves. And that's exactly what the interview process is, right? When you're applying for a new job, is you talk about like why you're so great and for
all the value you're going to add to the company, exactly. So on and so forth.
It's a completely different language to speak, but even for myself, I feel very uncomfortable doing that. And a lot of like what you'll hear from me a lot of the times is, this is what we did. This is what we as a group did. This is what we as a company did. This is what my team did. And I don't really want to put that emphasis on myself. This is what I did. So that's something that even for me, having grown up here in America, I've had to really sort of like learn how to do that. And I think that's not the case for a lot of people.
Provide some clarification around you interviewing people versus those other people. We're talking about your partners in the office. Mm-hmm. These are predominantly Caucasian from
Penn State.
Penn State, right? I mean, like, there's nothing wrong with that, right?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, but definitively there's a total cultural difference of who they are, what their experience is, what they look for, what they've learned.
And it's also like, it's intimidating, right? To be like a grad student or a college student, and then all of a sudden you're in a room with like someone who could be your dad or something like that, like someone who's so much older. And so even that aspect, like culturally, the idea of age is very different. Something Korean people do is we're obsessed with age. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also like really ingrained in our culture, like depending on whether you're older or younger, I'm going to address you differently. And a lot of times, like you might meet someone, it's like, hey, how are you? What's your name? Whatever. Oh, by the way, what year were you born in? Like, why does that matter? And like for Korean people, for Asian people, like that's such a huge cultural thing to, well, it's going to impact how I'm going to talk to you. It's going to impact how I address you and how I feel. When I started my first job, I met with the owner. He hired me and he said, "Hey, call me John." I was like, I don't want to do that. I felt so uncomfortable. This gentleman who was like older even than my father, and for me to like call him by his first name, it just felt so wrong. And so for probably 6 months to a year, I didn't address him. I never started a conversation. If I needed him to look at something, I would go to his office. I would stand near the door until he noticed me and be like, "Oh, hey, David, what's going on?" I was like, "Oh, hey, could you look at this?" And I just wouldn't call him by his name because it just felt so weird. It just didn't feel right.
What was the action that came out of that long term?
I mean, I think I just had to get over it. That wasn't a conversation at all.
But did you have to get over it? Or was that the choice that you ultimately just made?
That was a choice that I made for myself.
Yeah. And I think, like, just to hone in on that, that's why we're sitting here talking, right? Like, you didn't have to get over that. You chose to get over it.
Right.
Because there wasn't a platform, there wasn't a support system, there wasn't someone sitting there saying, "Hey, like, understand cultural differences."
Right. Well, and I wasn't even aware of it. I wasn't aware that I was doing that. Again, like I was the only Asian person in the room in the office, and so when we're talking about biases, like unconscious biases, this is the way I was brought up. This is how I think, and all of that happened automatically. But I wasn't aware that that's what was happening. And it wasn't until like much, much later, by the time I got to like, I don't know, but by the time I had already moved on to my next job at the lighting practice and like years later, and this is probably even like 5 years after that like initial job, like when I started to like think about like, oh, hey, like I'm an Asian person and like this might have something to do with it. Like that's how long it took me to realize like, oh, that's what was happening.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know, but I would say, what was the other side of the room seeing at the same time? Probably the same unconscious bias that you had. Like, oh, we're just doing things, we're working, this feels right. Maybe there's something awkward here, but whatever.
Right.
No,
or
not
just
whatever.
Like, oh, David is just this really quiet guy. Like he doesn't say very much.
Yeah. No, actually, David's culturally,
I have to respect you. I have to respect my elder. I can't just...
And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that either.
No,
right?
yeah.
But the way that that's taught, the way that it's implemented, and then the way that can be viewed because of cultural differences is, I think, what's really impactful here. I want to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to dive into just a couple more examples of things have happened. And then I want to conclude with talking about, how we can overcome this.
Sure.
It may seem like such a big thing, but the reality is it's probably never ending. And how we overcome it is we get started. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome.
Thanks, man.
Welcome back. Over the break, David and I were chatting just a little bit more about all the different things that he's not only experienced himself, but he's seen happen in the Asian lighting community specifically. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And before we get out of here today, we'll make sure that you have an idea on things you can do to not only become more aware, but help and support the people that are in the minority so that they have a better opportunity to not only be successful on their own, but make the teams that are part of that much more successful. David, talk to me a little bit more about the community that you are so much so ingrained in and have started this organization for, and things that you've seen happen.
Sure. So, like you said before, I co-founded the Asian lighting community, and even that, like I said, I could have just said I started this, and then called myself like, no, I co-founded this. I did this with someone else. We co-founded the Asian lighting community about 2 years ago. And that really came about with Gary Wong from Bold Lighting. He's a creative director at Bold. Through a lot of what I was doing with the ILD, as my lighting network kind of grew bigger and just getting to meet a lot more people, Gary and I met during the Lumen Awards one year, and we were just talking, and Gary said something really interesting. He's like, look at all these Asian people in this room. And again, this is like the New York City, right? This is the New York lighting community, and we're looking at the Lumens. It's packed with hundreds of people. He's like, look at all these Asian people in this room. And then while the awards are being given out and while people are giving the announcements, he's like, how many, like, if you look at the demographic of like the percentage of Asian people in this room to the people that are going up on the stage, it's like something's not right. And so he really wanted to tackle this from the sense of representation. And for me, it was everything that I was talking about earlier, like noticing the differences in how, even like in the recruiting, just like the very first step of like how someone meets my company at the lighting practice, like that already was such a big difference. And then also just recognizing that there were differences in how we worked as well. And so another example that I could give is during COVID, during the pandemic, it wasn't fun, right? We're all in lockdown. And fortunately for us, at the lighting practice, we got a very large project. It was a very large project that more than half of the office was working on. And we broke it out into smaller teams. And so I had this team, we're working on this portion of the project. And because it was COVID, because we had nowhere else to go, we would just keep working together. And it would have been a different thing if it was pre-COVID, where you're in the office and you're working together and you can see everyone who's around. But we're all at home, working from home and whatever. And what I decided to do was just have a really long Teams meeting going with my team. And so for the team that were the three of us, we basically were on the entire time and trying to like emulate what we would have in the office, where you could poke your head up and say, oh, hey, by the way, what is that manufacturer that you like using, or something like that. So we tried to create that. And what ended up happening is we were working till like 11 p.m. So then here I am on a Teams meeting that's going 4 or 5 hours long after the workday. And we're on till like 11 o'clock. And then the next week, as I'm talking to the partners, and they're saying, hey, how's this project going? And I was like, we're really busy. Like, this is a huge project. We're putting in a lot of time. And they're saying, well, it doesn't seem that way because your timesheets are not saying that. I was like, what are you talking about? We work till 11 p.m. almost every day. What are you like? And so then I started to review the timesheets of my team members, and it would say like 40 hours, 42 hours. And I was like, hey, Asian designer, what is going on? Because your counterpart, the non-Asian designers, they have like 50, 60 hours, but your timesheet says 40. Well, I just feel like I was taking longer to do that than I should. So I just felt like that was something that I was told it should take me 8 hours to do, and I took longer than that. So I feel like I shouldn't put that. I was like, no. That's not how timesheets work. That's not helpful for us. And like, I think there was a little bit of like, I don't know if I would call it like self-preservation or something. Like, I want to make it look better. Like, I want to make it look like that I'm killing it and that I'm doing all this work in a shorter amount of time. It's like, no, that's not really helpful for me as a project manager. I need to know how much time you're putting into it, even if it means that you're going over, and realize that that was sort of like a cultural thing to say like, oh, like this is on me. This is my fault that this took so much longer. Whether it was like, oh, well, the Revit model wasn't opening as fast. It's because this project is so big and like whatever. And I was like, that's not your fault. Like, I don't care if the Revit model took 30 minutes for you to open and that like really screwed up your workday. That's not on you. Why do you feel that you have to report something different than that was reality?
you're suggesting this all became part of, well, it's just how I feel. It's the culture I know.
Mm-hmm.
And they were comparing themselves to another person.
But it's like they wouldn't be able to see each other's timesheets. This is just what they think, right? And so it very much felt like I was told to do this in this amount of time, or I felt like this took longer than it was supposed to, and this was on me. And that idea of putting the blame on themselves instead of just being honest about like what it was. And like, I think that as a project manager or like any sort of supervisor, that's not a bad thing for me to say, oh, like you worked a lot last week. Like a good manager should be able to look at that and say, hey, I want to help you not do that. So I spoke to that designer. I sat down and we had to have that conversation multiple times because I saw it happening. And as we continue to have it, continue to encourage, that designer as well as everyone, be honest with your timesheets. And even still, like there are times when I'll find out from other designers like, oh, hey, this person was working till like midnight the night before. And I won't know because now we're sort of out of COVID and I'm not staying in the office as long, but like someone else can say like, oh yeah, we were in the office together till like 10:30 last night. Okay, why didn't the other person tell me that? Why is the Asian person not telling me that? And I'm hearing this from the other designer who's not Asian. So it's definitely an ongoing thing. But for that one designer, they're doing much better now. And I think that as it was important for us to have that conversation to say, hey, you need to be honest with your timesheet. And then that awareness also helped to build and have the conversation to say, oh, I do really want to work on my work-life balance. And you can't do that if we don't know like the whole picture of what everyone's doing.
In North America, where we have a lot of Caucasian people in this practice, they're a bit more bold. They're a bit more forthcoming. They're a little louder.
Yeah. Well, because we're taught that way, right? Yeah. Like we're taught you should speak your mind. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Like you should express yourself. And that's like a very core part, I think, of the American education system.
Is it a chicken and an egg of who has to say, let's get together and solve this? Is it a solvable problem? What do we need to do as a melting pot of people? How do you feel like we best break these barriers and build these bridges so that we're getting everything out of everyone and people truly do feel more comfortable and understanding there might also be some compromise there.
Right. Well, I think it's getting together in the local community. I think that for me, a lot of my awareness came from the fact that now there was another Asian person in the room. And it's been a really interesting journey because I started out by saying, oh, I see it in someone else and that can be fit. Like we can work on that together. And then it took another couple of years before I realized, oh, I do that too. Like that's in me as well. So I think that it's really important to be able to find people that look and think the way that you do and being able to share those experiences, knowing that, oh, this is something that we both do or we all do because there are certain ways that we grew up. And then I think there's the other aspect of getting together in community to also just say, hey, we should not just surround ourselves by people that, not surround ourselves with people that only look and to talk like us.
After everything you've described today, I just want to thank you and commend you for doing what you're doing right now, right? Sitting on this podcast, talking about all this culturally, I'm sure doesn't necessarily feel like something that you would just sit down and do. So my hat's off to you. Thanks for doing that. I really appreciate it. It's a conversation that we can share with so many other people, but not everybody gets the chance to maybe sit on a podcast or be a studio leader or, say, hey, I'm just going to start this.
Right.
There's people who are less tenured, they're junior, or as you mentioned in your own case earlier in life, just unaware.
Right.
So when people become aware of this stuff, there's communities that are being built for this. For folks who aren't necessarily identifying with the communities that exist to create that support system, but want to support it, what steps can they take? How can they look to see for the opportunity to help make that impact, and in maybe some cases, hopefully accelerate what we're talking about here?
I think the biggest thing is just being willing to learn and being able to say, oh, just because this is the way that I think does not mean it's the only way or that it's necessarily the best way. I think that really what helps to catalyze that change is to have that willingness to learn and to also just have conversations. Because even to recognize your own biases, that's a whole journey too. Like, you might not know that, like, this is what's going on in my brain, and I'm not even aware of that. And so I think there's definitely an aspect of like self-awareness and being able to like know yourself, and then also having those conversations with other people. I will say again, as I said in the beginning, like, thank you so much for having me here. Yeah. and really identifying, or for for you to identify me and to invite me to come in and to talk about this, because I do feel extremely privileged and for this opportunity. And also, yeah, just feeling a lot of, as an Asian person, I understand certain Asian perspectives. Like, Asian means like that's like billions of people from like so many different countries. Like, what I grew up with here and, as a Korean American is going to be very different than like, China, Japan, Thailand, whatever. And even for me, like, I'm still learning so much, even like from other Asians about like their cultures. And then also just, I'm very appreciative for, again, the diversity that the New York City has, and having these conversations with, with my Black friends or white friends. It was like, yeah, like, we all need to like get in this together. And
the one thing that I feel like you can help us all with too, I'm just speaking on behalf of people who aren't Asian. Maybe it's just me being a white male. This notion of being quiet, being proud, working hard, and keeping your head down. What can we do to open the door to make that person more comfortable so that they don't stand outside our office for 2 hours waiting for us to acknowledge them?
It's funny because I was going on a project tour I was going through a tour conducted by a designer of a project. And then after we had gone through the project, there was sort of like a Q&A session, and they opened it up. And someone on that tour asked a question, oh, did you guys also work on the back of house spaces? And I was like, this is a design tour, right? We're talking to the designer, and like, I thought if we're going to talk about anything, it would be like about the design and like how you got there. And you're asking about like back of house spaces. And then this sort of helped me to realize like, oh, like, I feel like there's a certain, like you were kind of saying, there's like a sort of like boldness of like, American culture, and like what we were saying before, like, there's no stupid questions you could ask, like, what, and that's a solid question to ask. But I think for an Asian person, they would sit there, and I've talked to a lot of people about the sort of like quietness of Asians, and there's been a lot of like, there are a lot of things to consider when someone decides to open their mouth. And I think that in American culture, it's, you have a thought and you say it. And I think that almost in a lot of times it feels like we hate the silence so much that we try to like fill up the quiet. But I think that for a lot of Asian cultures, like that's not entirely the case. Like, you know, if it's not adding value to a conversation, it's not adding, you know, like, I don't want to say it. And I've talked to people who have said like, I just don't know like what to say, or do I have to say something, or there's a whole list of them here that I had. Is this something that I should already know? Like if you're in a design meeting and you know, you're talking to your project manager and they like, should I even bring this up? Or if I say this, am I going to look stupid? Is this something that should be obvious? There are definitely like language barriers. If like English is not your first language, did I understand everything that has been said? And so then I think that it helps to say like, there was one of the other podcasts that you had with someone who was saying like the idea, the phrase of like spokes on a wheel, right? Like that's, if you're not a native English speaker, like that's not going to be something that's very obvious to you. There's also like, am I able to properly communicate and convey the idea that I have in my head? Is what's going to come out of my mouth going to make sense? And there's a lot of these like hesitations, but I think a big part of it too is there's also this idea of like, I don't want to be rude. I don't want to interject. And I don't know like when is the right time to speak up. Mm-hmm. And like, that's not something that I feel like a lot of, like, that's not something that like you're ever taught. You kind of just pick it up like through nuances. And so about a year ago, I started to do this thing where I was like, okay, let me try to observe who is speaking in like any given situation. And so TLP had a town hall, and you know, we're the whole, like all of our offices come together and we're all there and we're going through it, whatever, there's a Q&A. And I noticed that not a single person, like not a single Asian person ever raised their hands or asked any questions. And then you find that there are sort of the same people who will constantly always be asking questions or something like that. And I feel like, so to your point, like how do we help them to speak? Like how do we just help Asians to speak up? Or how do we, not even just Asians, but maybe like introverts, people who just don't think as fast or don't have like answers as fast? It helps to just have like a break just in conversation. Like a lot of times we're talking so quickly and like, oh, hey, you haven't said anything. It's like, oh, I'm not really sure. Like, I don't want to interrupt you. I don't want to break your chain of thought. And like, I think that that's a huge part of it. And then also offering up different ways to communicate. Like, if you're having like a design charrette, and like design charrettes are supposed to be this like fast, like let's throw out ideas kind of a thing. But if you're someone who doesn't come up with ideas right away or isn't able to like, you know, speak up right away, like if you can send that kind of information ahead of time so that they could prepare and they could like, you know, put it up on like a pinup board to say like, hey, this is the idea that I came up with in the time that I've been given, because that just doesn't happen for me. Or even to say like, you know, beyond just like verbal like communication, are there ways that you could send emails, or can it be like through messages? I think there's like, you know, even just like generationally, the idea of like pick up the phone and call someone versus, oh, I'm going to send them an email or I'm going to text them. You know, as a millennial, and also just like having been in this industry, is like, I've always been told like pick up the phone and call them. But, and that's what I've said too, but I've had to realize like that's not what Gen Z or Gen Alpha does. And that's not, and I think that this sort of applies also for people who generally tend to be a little bit quieter.
Mm-hmm. Opening that door, creating that opportunity, understanding. They may change to an extent. I mean, right? You finally bit the bullet, and after 6 months of standing by a door and just called your boss by his first name, but like that doesn't have to happen, right? There's always an opportunity to meet in the middle, and it really starts by not only understanding there's probably a fundamental difference, but welcoming that conversation. I want to thank you for this conversation today. I want to thank you for the examples and the vulnerability you've expressed, and sharing this so that we can all learn from you. I know the Asian Lighting Community is an organization you co-founded. How can people find that as a resource to learn more about this, take that journey, get involved, and what other organizations also exist that you feel like are important for us to know about?
So I am very grateful for Elaine and for the Equity and Lighting Group, also for Kelly and the Wild team. When we first started up the Asian Lighting Community, we did talk to both Kelly and Elaine and just like, hey, do you guys have any tips for us as a new organization? But also, I think that what Elaine is doing and just sort of saying like, hey, we can all work together. And I think that by keeping it general, like we've had a lot of conversations, and she has offered a lot of times to say like, if you need like I don't know, like a bank account or something like that. Like she's like, you could umbrella that under the Equity and Lighting umbrella or something. I'm appreciative of like what Light Justice is doing. I think that for what we were talking about, a lot of what we talked about today is about the workplace and how do you apply that in the workplace. I think that a lot of what Light Justice is doing, and I think Edward is also doing a session today here at the Enlighten conference about, how do you use light as a tool for justice, and how do you provide it in different communities where, it might not be as accessible? How do we provide good lighting even for those back of house spaces? And then, just really, I think there's a lot of really incredible groups out there. I'm looking forward to getting together with Quincy while we're here and talking about Build and how we can support each other. And I think as far as like the Asian Lighting Community, you can find us on Instagram, you can find us on LinkedIn, also through email. So just Asian Lighting Community at Instagram, or if you search that in LinkedIn. And then we also have an email address at asianlightingcommunity@gmail.com.
And if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way they can reach out?
You can find me on LinkedIn, but like I also don't accept like the requests if like I've never met you before. So it's not really the best place to find me. If you are going to find me on LinkedIn, definitely like add a message to say like why you're reaching out, because there's a lot of like the spam or whatever on LinkedIn.
Awesome. David, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the conference here in San Diego, connecting with so many lighting professionals, learning a little bit, and good luck presenting this conversation to the audience that attends your session later this week.
Thanks so much, Sam. Very happy to be here.
We'll talk to you soon. See ya.
Cool. Thanks.
Hey, it's Sam. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Light Pod. In case you didn't know, this entire episode was actually also produced with a video attached to it. So make sure wherever you listen to this, you think about watching it next time. It's amazing the connection you'll have when you not only listen, but you watch the brilliant minds who join us to celebrate the people, the process, and the product behind design. Until the next episode, stay brilliant, be bold, and never let your inspiration go. I'll talk to you soon. See ya.